everybody, and welcome. I'm Alex Elliott. I'm the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. We are so excited that you could join us today for On the Inner Work of Racial Justice. As many of us are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, we, CIIS public programs, must recognize and never forget that our university's building in San Francisco occupies traditional, unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands. If you're interested in learning more about Native lands, languages, and territories, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Now let me first introduce our presenters, Rhonda Magee and Damali Robertson, and then we'll get right to their conversation. Damali Robertson joins the California Institute of Integral Studies as Assistant Director of Diversity and Inclusion after a 15-year career in progressive nonprofit leadership. From 2008 to 2011, Damali helped pioneer diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at the Haas Center for Public Service. More recently, she spent a year leading an in-depth racial equity project to address the achievement gap between Black students and their peers at a Bay Area high school. Most recently, she co-led DEI initiatives at Root and Rebound, while also leading their fundraising and communications efforts, creating campaigns about the systemic injustices and disparities built into America's criminal legal system. She is also a restorative justice and mindfulness practitioner who approaches everything with a restorative impulse, integrity, and lots of deep breaths and compassion. Rhonda Magee is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco. Also trained in sociology and mindfulness-based stress reduction, she is a highly practiced facilitator of trauma-sensitive, restorative, MBSR interventions for lawyers and law students, and for minimizing the effects of social identity-based bias. Magee has been a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Law and Society and a visiting professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Damali and Rhonda.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here and in conversation with you tonight. Rhonda, how are you?
Hello. And the excitement is mutual. I'm so glad to be here with you. And I'm doing all right. I'm here in San Francisco. And thanks so much for being in conversation with me.
Absolutely. I am just so grateful for you, your body of work, all the contributions you've made to the field of mindfulness, racial justice. And so we're going to dig into your book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice. We're going to talk about mindfulness and the ways that we can support one another with that inner work that's so foundational. So I have tons of questions for you, and I feel like I really just want to jump in to ask you, when did you begin a formal mindfulness practice and what got you started?
So I guess I began my formal mindfulness practice. 1993 is the year that comes to mind as one important date, because that was the year that I finished law school, the year that I moved permanently from Virginia to California, took the bar, and then had a period of time where I was waiting for my results, but also waiting for the date for my job to start. In other words, I had a period of time where I actually could relax. And the first thing I realized was I was completely unable to. I was not practiced. I did not know how to relax. I had been on the go, studying and trying to achieve and trying to take advantage of the opportunities that prior generations of people who look like me, by the way, who grew up in the South as I did, taking advantage of the opportunities that prior generations didn't have. So really I was finding myself in need of support for being able to, reclaim my attention and calm my nerves a little bit. And so I started reading books and happened to find a book that opened up a doorway into formal meditation practice. And so it was first just reading and really practicing at home, like many people who are on this or listening to my voice might have done themselves, just reading something, hearing something. At that time, there were not a lot of podcasts or other things like that. But so I just read and put the book down and tried to practice. And even that felt a little bit like a relief. And so I continued to pursue other opportunities to experiment with meditation from there. But when I think about that question, I also think about the fact that I had informal training in some sort of practice for centering that I observed in the life of my grandmother, who many of you may have, if you read my book, you may have heard me tell this story before, but my grandmother was a person who had been called to the ministry, so that every day of the time that I spent as a little girl in her presence, I saw her get up before dawn and spend time in her room in what I later learned was like a centering prayer practice. Prayer and then studying scripture and really just getting clear on her purpose and value before going out and doing hard work in the world. She cleaned houses for other people. She didn't have a glamorous job like I do by comparison, right? So those, when I think about both the entry to what I call mindfulness meditation, I think of those trainings that I read about, which, by the way, were coming from a Hindu tradition, I will just name. It was a book I remember reading. It was called the Bhagavad Gita for Daily Living. And I say that to name that a lot of these things that we call mindfulness are, as we know, translations of practices that have been lovingly delivered in this multicultural context that we call the United States of America right now, right? By people who have inherited and carried these practices over generations. And so I feel I'm just naming the debt of gratitude that I know I owe to people who from Asian heritages, South Asian, Indian heritage, in particular, the first book that I read. But I know that a lot of the things that I've been privileged to study have been delivered to this context from different parts of Asia. So that, and then, Kinston, North Carolina, and my grandmother's, own centering practice, those are the roots for me.
Yeah. And you know what? I love that you bring your grandmother in, because I think, we look at meditation and we think that's this particular practice, but what you just talked about, her prayer, was centering. People journaling is centering. Yes. Walking can be centering. There's so many things that we do on a daily basis that if we do it with a certain amount of intention is centering. So I just love that you brought your grandmother into the room with us. Yeah. Because I remember watching my grandmother pray too before she would start her day as a teacher. And I thought to myself, as you said that, more of us are practicing something mindful than we probably know.
Exactly. And so becoming aware, right? That knowing what we know is, I think, an important insight. It isn't necessarily about engaging in a brand new practice. Mm-hmm. It may be about just becoming more clear about what you have seen, observed, been exposed to, that looks like, if engaged in on a regular basis, and in your experience, from having done it or having witnessed it, it actually can help calm you, center you, support you in accessing your inherent power and inherent sense of belonging. Whatever can deliver you to that, in my estimation, it can be a support for really moving more skillfully in the world, including addressing issues of race and racism more skillfully.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rhonda. I mean, the truth is, when I was reading your book, I was just nodding, along the way. I was saying to myself, you had me at hello, right? I was like, yes, because I can make the connection in the ways that mindfulness clearly advances and supports racial justice work. I just wondered, though, as I was reading it, what about the folks who, may not see themselves there yet? Like, there are people who are probably like, I don't know how these two go together. And I wondered if you could maybe say a little bit more to someone who doesn't quite make the connection.
Right. Well, it's so interesting, Damali, that, one of the aspects of my journey that I'm going reflect on in response to this question is just having had conversations with people about the intersections between racial justice and activism work on the one hand, anti-racist, managing bias, even DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion on one hand, and mindfulness on the other. Nowadays people are hearing a little bit about this here or there. But when I started the connection had not been made. And even today, I'm surprised by how often I'll have someone hear a conversation of mine and contact me or say to me, I have studied mindfulness for many years. I have been trying to do anti-racism work or reading about it or trying to wake up to it or reckoning in the last couple of years. It never occurred to me to bring these two together. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that when I'm thinking about people who don't see the connection, I'm always curious about, well, what part of this does resonate? Because for some people I understand mindfulness, but I don't see how it relates. Like I've been practicing mindfulness, I've been doing this, but I haven't seen racial justice work as part and parcel of my work in mindfulness. Or for other people, it could be, I've been doing I've been living with the consequences of being in a racist society for all my life. I've been doing activism work, and I'm not sure how mindfulness connects. So I'm always curious really what doorway people are coming in through. And from that place, what I like to do is invite people to, from the place that they are entering the conversation, think about any difficulty that they've experienced along the way. And where is that difficulty? Mm-hmm. And when reflecting on a particular story or a particular experience, then to ask if, in particular, if there's a way in which your identity, your social identity, is something that you have suffered in, right? You felt some, targeted by bias, or you've witnessed people suffering through a form of their identities. And so when we start looking at how people have felt and experienced harm through identity, then I can open up a conversation about, how might practices that allow you to pause, notice the thoughts, emotions, and sensations that travel with that story or that experience. And notice the sensation of breathing as you take maybe a conscious deep breath, and just sense into how just the breath can support us in accessing, again, a capacity to inwardly restore or access a calm within a storm. And might that be a skill that or just an ability that any one of us might benefit from as we navigate a world in which identity-based harm is a feature, not a bug. It's a feature of our society. So how might we draw on that? I often invite people to just do a breath, imagine, experience. Unfortunately, sometimes I can pull it out of the news. I remember doing a podcast with someone some years ago, actually, and there had been a shooting in the news that day, and there was a race aspect to it. And we talked about it. She hadn't heard about it. It came up in the conversation, and I said, let's pause and right here, right now, imagine using a portable mindfulness practice to support us and being able to get back on track with this interview, because I could feel the way in which she was getting emotionally challenged by this news. And so that's we have experiences all the time that give us a little bit to practice. And I often believe that it's less about convincing people intellectually and being evangelical about it, but it is an opportunity to ask people, well, let's experiment with it. What is it like? And what might a pausing and a breathing practice right here, right now offer as a support?
Wow. And you know what? There's a couple of things you said there. I feel like people are so busy, and you mentioned busyness at the top of our conversation. And that pause just sounds like it is the connector, the ability to stop and pause. And then there's a curiosity that you bring to the examples that you've given that I think also facilitate these types of mindful conversations, but also the relationship, the trust building, the safety necessary for some of these conversations. At least that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, exactly. And also the kind of underlying care,
Mhm.
because I do think an ethic of care is for me at the root of mindfulness. It's not always the first thing that people hear when they hear something about mindfulness, right? People hear about breathing and, you know, becoming more clear, clearing the mind and, reclaiming attention, focusing. But underlying all of it, I think, from all of that, all that I've been fortunate to learn about it, is this invitation to kind of become more intimate with our own life experience
Mm.
and more caring, right? Because this desire to
Mm.
minimize suffering, starting with ourselves, and then from there, maybe we can also, right, maximize our ability to minimize suffering for other people. But yeah, so there is that caring quality that I think is also a big part of it for me.
Yeah. And, I heard you say in an interview, justice for me is what love looks like in public. And I love this. I heard you say it and I was like, yes, right? I mean, and so that takes us back to caring.
Mhm.
And I wonder, with this view of justice, if there's anything you could offer us, any insights you could offer to how we get there. How do we, as this highly racialized society, get to a place where we can see justice as love?
Mm. Thank you so much for this question. And because it's a profound one, and it invites me to say a couple things just by way of acknowledgement. I think, again, we are all so privileged to have inherited so much that supports us, or that might support us in this kind of work. If we just start turning more to it. And so that literal definition of justice being what love looks like in public is one I've borrowed, learned, inherited from a philosopher and teacher, Cornel West, who is one of our teachers in our public discourse these days. But also, it resonated for me because another one of them, sure, our mutual teachers, mine and Cornell and maybe others, you maybe Martin Luther King Jr., who also, when talking about justice, often, right, he spoke so eloquently and beautifully in a lot of less well-reported speeches and writings about, this sort of fierce quality of love that undergirds efforts to resist oppression. Always about love as a kind of a way of thinking about justice, insofar as it's about accessing a kind of a love power to come into confrontation with that which stands against the impulse we have to take care of each other. In other words, a lot of what he was talking to or speaking to is that within each of us that actually does care when we see somebody suffering, and that we can be trained out of responding to that altruistic impulse, that sort of non-transactional care and concern for other fellow human beings that many of us know we're in touch with, and some of us are kind of out of touch with. And so I think the invitation of a lot of people like Martin Luther King, like even Colin Kaepernick now, he's quoted recently of saying, we resist out of love, right? The invitation to really understand that at the root of a lot of these efforts to fight oppression is this desire to see us all treated with the care and respect and dignity that we deserve. Underlying the idea of human rights is this idea of innate, inherent entitlement to a kind of basic dignity in terms of how we are met in the world. And so, of course, when we think about justice, often what we're fighting is for that kind of dignity, respect, public caring treatment. And, it's not something that comes naturally to a lot of us, or even if it had at one point, we've been sort of trained out of it, I think almost coarsened to live in today's society. It's like everybody is so busy, as you mentioned. We've all been struggling so much with so much, everybody. Our struggles aren't the same, but I'm just going to say, it seems to me that there's a lot of woundedness in all of us. And yet, part of our dominant culture is about patterns of dominance. That's what we've inherited. That's what enslavement was about. That's what, patterns of exclusion were about, that Asian American heritage folks experienced. That's what, settler colonialism was about. We've inherited a lot of the energy of domination, which makes it hard to have your soft bellied, carbon-based, in case, your heart, right, out on your sleeve, as they say. But so it's not easy to bring this sort of quality of love and care as justice into public discourse. But I think we just have to name it and keep claiming it. I think part of how we fight any kind of oppression is to say, be that amen choir. So I love, Damali, when you're saying you're reading, you're like, yes, yes, because we need to hear each other affirm things that we actually do feel, but we don't hear lifted up enough. It's not going to happen overnight, but we do what we can. We do what we can where we are.
Yes. And I just appreciate you mentioning Dr. King, and I want to just bring him in one more time, because I heard your quote, and then I went back to his letter from a Birmingham jail and read where he talked about justice being intentional. It's persistent. I don't want to misquote him.
Yes.
But he asked, how devoted are we to justice, in that letter. And I thought he felt a real urgency. So I really appreciate that you mentioned Dr. King again, because I really was there reading that letter again, inspired by your quote. So,
that letter is so powerful, right? And so current in a way, because he's really in a way saying, what I really need is for people who would say they stand with me, but are kind of silent.
Yes.
To stand up. And again, speak and call forth, and stand with. Don't just be silent, or you send me an email after.
Right.
Stand up with me, take a stand, right? Because silence is complicity.
Yeah.
And we really need that message as well. So many of his messages are just so resonant for today.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that, because I just think, yes. Anyway, in your book, you also speak about racism and discrimination having a double edge. So it's hurting people on all sides, ultimately. Anyone who's impacted, whether that is someone who is feeling the brunt or someone who is probably experiencing it from a more privileged place. So could you say some more about the ways that you see this double edge and how racism hurts us all?
Yeah. And, it's so, thank you for this question. It's reminding me that, number one, I've been trying to make this point and having conversations with folk to invite us to reflect on this, because again, I will say that the way that I embrace the role of teaching about all of these things, there is this piece that's about me sharing my insight, but really it's very invitational. It's very much about let us look deeply and closely at our own lives. Let us have the courage, let us have space, let us find, right, places and spaces where we can be supported in just looking at what we already know. Because I think when we do that, we can see so many different stories. A story that I tell, one of the first stories I tell in my books about, my first, I think it is the first story really about my being a young girl in love with someone who was from a family, white Southern family, racialized white, as I say it, to underscore the way that it's a social construct. But this particular family, when they found out that the two of us were together, this son of theirs, who was their beloved son, let me just say, their apple of the family eye, right? When this came out, suddenly he was under internal attack in the family for his decision to date me across the racial line. And it led to him literally being thrown out of the house, rendered homeless.
Wow.
for a time. I don't know if I shared this in the book. My family actually took him in for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just an example that we can be driven by some idea about, sort of policing the love line, if you will, right? Where somebody's affection can really go. Some idea about that can lead us to such an act as making our own kin, our own, children homeless. Like that to me was one of the experiences that led me to really be curious about what are the other ways. Heather Magee, to just name another author who's been writing about this, published a book recently called The Sum of Us, which takes as its thesis this very point. Like when we look at what's happening, right, the need to then explain and invite reflection on how racism is harming everybody. And from her perspective as a public policy maker, right, she was looking at, well, what is happening with healthcare? Why is it that we see people, or how do we see people voting against their own personal interests, against taking up, some sort of more publicly supported and available healthcare, that which we all as human beings, again, in recognition of the basic core needs of humanity for care and support, for flourishing and healing when we're ill. We all need healthcare, and yet we see people voting against it disproportionately in Southern states with high proportions of Brown and Black people. We see these correlations that seem to be related to our historical patterns of racial divide. Same thing with education. We underinvest in education, public education. We have been pulling money out of public education since desegregation. Right. So these are just some of the ways. So we have these systemic and public ways that are really, really voting rights. We're seeing it again. All of our voting rights are being threatened because the dominant, sort of the dominant forces that kind of resist multiracial and multicultural democracy are reacting to the past generations post-civil rights gains facilitated by the Voting Rights Act and all sorts of different things. But we're seeing a backlash to the gains that have been accomplished in the direction of greater participation in voting and more positive, from my perspective, outcomes from more free and fair elections. And so now all of us are vulnerable to having folks tossing our votes because our signature doesn't match up with some version of what it should be. So those are just some of the ways that we do all suffer systemically, publicly on the one hand, personally, interpersonally, maybe even in our families on the other. Within our own selves, we can just invite inquiry. How have we suffered, no matter what our background? And I just want to also add that when it comes to the part that people of color suffer, I've been looking at these issues for many years and a student of our history, growing up in the South and going to school at University of Virginia. I mean, writing about reparations way back in the day, my first public paper, back in 92 or whenever, right? I have been looking at these issues for a long time, but I am coming back to a deep consideration of the trauma that people of color have internalized and often are tempted and do play out within our own communities. My own experience, as I write about in my book, I am a child of what, now we call these adult, survivors of childhood traumas, right? I had multiple childhood traumas in my own personal experience. Not just those that are legacies in a systemic way of the histories that we're talking about, right? My family being comprised of people who were working class, poor, living in, my father was from Mississippi, my mom from North Carolina, struggling to get a decent education and working class jobs. My dad goes into the military and suffers as a result of that. Stepdad suffered as a result of that, became alcoholics, right? So alcoholism, abuse in the household, domestic violence against my mom, and then abuse of the children in the household,
Right.
myself included. So there are so many ways that we play out these traumatic legacies in our own lives, in our own communities, in our own homes. And I want to just name that because I think an important part of what I hope is the takeaway of bringing mindfulness to bear in the service of racial justice is what I often refer to as the personal justice call.
Yes.
That part that's about, let's take care of this person, not in a selfish way. Understand the difference between selfishness and self-care, and really seeing caring, as Audre Lorde has said, as Angela Davis has said, it is an act of resistance and really the first approximation of what justice looks like to me. How do I love this body and these bodies that I'm with in ways that can really help disrupt all of the messages that have come handed down to us through the generations that our lives don't matter?
Yes. And it's interesting because you said so much that I was like, yes. And it made me think of another book. We're going to talk about all these books. My Grandmother's Hands, where it's devoted to trauma, racialized trauma, and metabolizing, right? And metabolizing that trauma, right? It's the importance of and using mindfulness practices, but just being in tune with the trauma, because you had a quote in your book from Thich Nhat Hanh where he talked about the fact that there's a lot to be done in society. He says work against war, social injustice, and so on, but first we have to come back to our own territory and make sure that peace and harmony are reigning there, our own territory, which I think is exactly what you were talking about.
Yes.
Because we can't do anything for anyone unless we're actually attuned to what's happening within, which I think is like the mic drop of the entire.
Isn't it? I mean, we can barely do anything. And we run the risk of the things that we try to do at our highest and best if we haven't done our own work, right? If we haven't done our own coming home to making peace within this territory, we do run the risk of working for some version of justice or, the good that has embedded in it, some of these ways that we can transmit our unhealed woundedness out and allow it to infuse whatever we might be trying to offer in the world. And so for me, it's like, it's also, I'll say there is a little bit of selfishness in this. I said, it's not selfish. There is a little bit, which is about like, you don't want to have to wait until whatever that distant day, like we're fighting for new laws and new policies and this in our neighborhood. And we're going to keep organizing, building coalitions and working for change. And some of us, we've been able to see some of the benefits of some of those things. And then we see the backlash and we get frustrated and we have to keep at it. I think one of the important aspects of personal justice and self-care, what it does for me is it's about saying, as Alice Walker, to mention another author and teacher, right, says, don't miss the color purple, right? She really meant that. As a mindful social justice, in a way, kind of message. Like, no matter what we're going through, no matter how much we have suffered, and we know her heroine in that book, Celie, was, right, in that intersectional way, suffering all kinds of abuse, legacies of the interlocking patriarchy, racist, capitalist, all of that, right? And yet that basic message, even as we are healing and working to make the world a better place, make room for joy. Don't miss the color purple, right? Don't miss the gift of being alive. And to me, if as we are doing our justice work, we are, burning the candle at both ends and like getting ourselves completely flat out exhausted and burned out and in conflict and arguing with everybody,
Mm-hmm.
When our relationships are faltering,
Mm-hmm.
something is amiss, right? Something profound is amiss. So bringing justice home first and foremost is really, 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 I think, important. And it is not to say, therefore, we don't have to do the other work. No,
Right.
it's the both and. It's the both.
Yes. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about teachers like Adrienne Marie Brown, who does a lot around pleasure.
Yes.
And I can just tell you for myself, Black woman, single parent, lots of things. And I thought my job was survival for many years. Like, I just need to get through the day. But really what I've learned in my most kind of last 5 years is it's so important to have joy. It's so important to aim for thriving. The intention be thriving, joy, purpose, following your bliss.
Yes.
And that's my mantra now. And the activism, it's still a priority for me, but I do recognize I'm not able to really be there for anyone if I can't be there for myself and have some joy. So
true. And joy can come in the activism.
Yes.
If this is our orientation, right? Mm-hmm. Then we realize, like, working side by side towards something, even when we don't always win, but we learn that we can see I know from my own experience working with people to try to make a positive difference somewhere. There's joy in that. And we need to see that, don't miss that.
Yes. Yes, I love that. And there's something you said, you keep saying these remarkable things. And so I wanted to just stop for a second on another, what I call mic drop moment, is this idea of race as a social construct. And I'll say why, because I'm pretty grown. I've been around for a while, and I've only just in the last few years really gotten that race is a social construct. I've just really gotten that there isn't anything scientific or biological or physiological about being racialized Black, being racialized white. We have different cultures, cultural experiences for sure.
Yeah.
And I lift that up. And there is nothing that separates us truly.
No.
And I wanted you to say something more about that, because when I got that, my whole life changed. I was like, oh, so I actually can walk in the world in a different way. So I wanted to just have you comment.
And thank you so much. That is, it is a statement that when I make it, I write about it, I'm often met on the one hand with people that sometimes it'll be like, what do you mean? Explain that more. And, but often it'll be people who will say, yes, I've heard that, but really they don't know what it means and they don't really believe it. And they'll finally at some point have the whatever it is to say, can we really talk about that part? Because I really don't know about that. And I'll say that, what I'm drawing on when I make that statement is, research, the kind of human anthropological social science community is the majority. There are always detractors, right? There's always going to be people who kind of want to go back to this, what I'm going to just say, the pseudoscience of race that provided a basic, illusory, but appealing kind of hard sciencey seeming foundation for racism. Okay, we had many different pseudoscientists of race from Europe who starting in in earnest in the 17th and 18th centuries, writing about these 5 different racial branches of humankind. Now, mind you, these scholars often had never traveled outside of Europe, but they had heard stories told about, from the explorers and the early, settlers and colonists coming back with tales of the types of humankind that they'd seen. And, these scholars often drawing on the work they were doing, looking at, botany, looking at plant life, took some of those ways of categorizing and describing life into descriptions about humankind that have been debunked by scientists.
Mhm.
We know that we can share blood, we can mate across right humankind of all kinds,
Mhm.
and so the geneticists, the DNA specialists have also confirmed, right, the degree to which we are all really one human family. There is, obviously we have genetic variation. That's the beauty of humanity. What I sometimes use the phrase, the 10,000 flowers, right? We are all these beautifully unique creatures with all different shades and hair textures and eye shapes and this and that. But fundamentally, are we one species? Absolutely.
Mhm.
And yet, wherever we are and around the world and in different cultures, we've constructed ways of grouping, categorizing folks. And in the US and in other often Western nations, we've made a lot of this idea of race. But other cultures haven't made as much of the idea of race, but they have often something else, some other thing that it might be religion. It might be, something about, where people live and, so the sociologists tell us that we often categorize each other and use those categories to rank each other in terms of value and worth somehow.
Mhm.
And so from a sociological standpoint, it's very common that we organize and then rank. And we kind of make up categories as necessary to support that in our culture. And the more fixed categories where we see this type of categorizing, age and gender. But even gender, we know, is much more fluid than we've given to believe. And age, of course, we are all going to go through a spectrum if we're lucky, from young to old. But again, across the world, you'll see different values being placed on people of different age groups and different genders. And then depending on where you are, you see something called race being described, defined, all of this ideological work being placed in service of what? Usually some form of oppression. In our culture, it was to justify the variations of oppression, slavery, land clearing, by which we, ended up on places like, the formerly Ohlone land that I am on right now in San Francisco, right? So to justify exclusionary policies against Asian American people who for a time in the late 19th century, early 20th century were deemed to be a threat to the white working class in California, so much so that we ended up with all kinds of exclusionary policies. And then the legacies of those were sort of at the foundation of what led to our being able to do internment against Japanese Americans in World War II. So the different, how race has led to oppression varies. But if we don't understand that each society, culture, geographic moment that we're in, we're tempted to continue the work of creating and recreating and reifying, making more fixed than is true, than is scientifically true, certainly, these ideas that we have about racial difference. When we become aware that there is this, that we're doing this, we are constructing these things, then sometimes people say, well, then that means race isn't real, then we don't have to talk about racism. That is not right. Because just because race is not biologically real doesn't mean it is not. It's very socially real. Right. It's very, very much still a feature of our social lives. And so we can both be looking at becoming more conscious of how we are participating or not in reifying the categories and how we can disrupt that a bit. We can recognize multiraciality in and amongst all of us much more than we have been given to do in the past. At the same time, I think it's important for us to figure out how to recommit to doing the work of ending racial injustice.
Right.
looking at racism when it shows up, looking at bias when it shows up, naming it, and looking at our demographics in our spaces. And from that place of like, you know, a little bit of an audit, like where are we doing well? Where could we be doing better?
Right.
Looking at, you know, what's going on and what we might need to do differently to bring about more racial justice and equity where we are. So it's that both and. It's like both understand it's a construct, let's minimize it, and let's minimize the temptation to organize our whole lives around it. And by minimize, I don't mean to, you know, that we disavow that we have cultures that we respect or cultures in the world that we honor. It is that we want to minimize this sort of inherited notion that these are fixed ideas. And then we can choose how we want to be in relationship to projects of racial justice and equality. And because lastly, I just want to say, while the sociologists are clear, all across the world, there's a temptation amongst humankind to categorize and rank.
Right.
There is at the same time across the world a tendency, a countervailing tendency against this effort to rank and dominate. There is this tendency I alluded to before toward altruism, toward egalitarianism, toward a narration about public love and human dignity that undergirds this idea of universal human rights. So wherever we are, it's like this sort of struggle. How do we want to be a part of the egalitarian impulse to a world where we can all flourish and thrive, actually? Or do we want to be a part of, you know, the old story of some of us matter more than others? And so we're all, I think, called to choose how we want to be in relationship to these longstanding moral challenges that travel with the dynamics of racialization in our time.
Yeah, I mean, and again, so much there to unpack and to like discuss. One thing that, as you were talking about race being a social construct, and as we were talking about, this doesn't mean that we don't deal with race. Like, even though we understand this and know this, some of us, you know, it doesn't mean that our society doesn't have this racialized underpinning tone. It's not everywhere around us, right? And so one of the things that struck me too in the book is when you talked about the fact that the mindfulness practices alone are not enough to support the work of racial justice, that there is an importance of learning the history, of understanding, you know, who and what came before us in order to create something different going forward. And it made me think of what I perceive as an attack on critical race theory. It made me think of recent legislation that has passed in 8 states and new legislation being introduced in 20 states. And I wondered what your thoughts might be on the fact that I think the legislation is trying to write the discomfort out of our history, is asking, and everything in your book feels to me like being with the discomfort, being with the pain, being even with, you know, as someone who's racialized Black, you know, being with my own, the trauma that has been part of my own legacy. So all of us being with the discomfort takes us further, is my kind of takeaway, and wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Oh, Damali, I mean, there's so much. Yes, absolutely. I do think we are due as a culture, and maybe humankind is due for this kind of adulting process whereby we can more deeply stay with difficult things and do hard things together, you know. And yeah, my book is very much about finding that within myself, that the kind of leaning into mindfulness practices as a support for looking at what I need to do that's difficult, right? And sort of staying, you know, turning toward, this is where my term of color insight comes in, right? Rather than being colorblind and turning away from these issues, but actually saying, I want to know, I want to understand, I want to see, I want to be able to sit with, I want to work with race and racism as it's showing up in my life, right? I don't want to give it more attention or more air than it needs, but I also don't want to ignore it when it does need to be addressed. How can I develop within myself the wherewithal to do that? And, you know, it isn't easy, and you're absolutely right. I think one of the ways we're seeing this backlash that I alluded to before is, currently showing up in a kind of a backlash against what is called critical race theory, which, as a law professor, one of the people who studied and was so inspired by the original critical race theory writings that emerged from law in the late 1980s, 1990s, and then were picked up in masters of education, graduate programs in education, and then became, this other thing. I guess what I'm trying to say is I have an understanding of critical race theory that that dates back to and draws on the originators of it.
Right.
And of course, I know from all of that the effort there was simply to provide support for learning about the aspects of our history and including our legal history that help us understand why we are still so caught up in a politics and practices of racialization and racial hierarchy. Why racism is still a feature of our lives. How are we going to understand that problem better? And don't we need to understand that problem better if we're going to do law and policy that disrupts it rather than enacting law and policy that simply, as one of the early critical race theorists, a white racialized woman, her name is Reva Segal, writes, we want to avoid preserving the status quo of racial hierarchy by transforming it, right? Which is a pattern she saw. We seem to be preserving it by transforming. We transform from slavery to, peonage, and then, and Black codes and segregation. But what stayed the same? The basic outlines of the hierarchy and the way they feed racial capitalism. Like, that's been our history since enslavement, right? How do we use the ideology of race to amass wealth here, disadvantage people there, maintain an ability to move capitalism, and then move the political economy, the particular kind of democracy infused with a lot of autocratic leanings for certain people that we don't want to vote, right? How do we, this kind of democracy that has accommodated racism since the founding, since the Constitution. Critical race theorists have been saying, we need to understand that better. And we need to wake up to some of the ways that now in this era of supposed race neutrality, right, that followed the disestablishment, I'm quoting, air quoting, of segregation. Like, we feel like we went through a period, Martin Luther King came, we marched, we had the Voting Rights Act, we ended segregation. And yet I have my students come to me and say, wait, when did we end segregation? I went to an entirely segregated school.
Wow.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
We look at the data that show us that schools are more segregated across the country in the South today, actually, than they were during the civil rights movement. We look at the data that shows that our neighborhoods remain segregated, and wealth, the accumulation of wealth continues to be disparate in terms of, racialized groups. So we have, in other words, a lot of evidence, if we look at the history of what the critical race scholars are pointing to, that suggests we need to be skeptical of claims that race neutrality, that we just say, we're not talking about race.
Right.
That means we're not racist. They're like, no, look at your history. Obviously, there is this tendency in law and policy to actually preserve the status quo hierarchies by transforming it. And so let's look at how that happened in the law and how the law allowed it when we moved from slavery to debt peonage and Black codes and segregation. Let's look at how the law accommodated the hierarchy all through that. And now let's look at how the law might be accommodating the hierarchy right now, even though we're in the race neutral period, technically. That's what critical race theory was all about. And it required that you look at history. Like, it just said, how can you understand any of this if you're not willing to at least know how we got here and know the history that's often not taught? And there's so much of that.
Oh, yeah.
So yes, it's meditation and it's study, and it's being in communities where you can have conversations like this. these are all components of color insight and working well, I think, to disrupt injustice.
And, something popped up for me as you were talking too, is that I think the fact that we don't learn about this history can be we can have this idea that racism is something that is just an issue in the South. We can have this idea that, in California, we're so progressive and liberal. And I remember years ago learning about, for example, the ways certain neighborhoods were constructed, like Palo Alto versus East Palo Alto. And that, literally Black people were not allowed to purchase homes in Palo Alto, which is something that when we look around today, things didn't just happen, like race, they were constructed. It was a design. And I feel like learning about that helps us undo that. It's the learning and getting close to that helps us say, well, we won't do that again.
Exactly. Learning is an allied discipline of meditation. That's the phrase that I learned, inherited, and use here. So becoming more conscious of how history is repeating itself, how our neighborhoods were constructed around racism. Palo Alto, heck, the house I live in here in San Francisco.
Right.
So, this neighborhood was a neighborhood where those racially restrictive covenants that you talk about having been necessary to form Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. Racially restrictive covenants were a feature of San Francisco and most places in the US, and were a feature running with the deeds of our homes, and even through sales and transactions, even after the Supreme Court disallowed them and disavowed them. Neighborhoods wanted segregation for a long time. It was true of this very neighborhood where I am in San Francisco, where people like Willie Mays, not far from here actually, was one of the first people to desegregate, and then had neighbors, really harassing him until he and his wife moved out. So, our neighborhoods, the lives we live today, are infused by these histories more than we realize. So yes, developing a commitment to, pausing, bringing in the ability to stop, notice what's happening in our bodies to help us heal from all of the ways we can be feeling challenged by the pain of these histories, triggered by the legacies of oppression that we see right around us right now, microaggressions impacting us in our schools, in our workplaces. Bringing mindfulness to bear to help us work through all of that, and to find our people that we want to work with, whatever they look like, whatever their backgrounds, because there have always been people of all racialized backgrounds trying to fight to disrupt oppression. We need to find each other, and we need to be able to work together. So meditation can help us with the difficulty of that, but we do also need the commitment to study, to learn, and to be in conversations like this. Building communities of learning and practice is really another piece of this as well.
Thank you. And you know what? This reminds me, I really want to ask a question that takes us kind of from the macro down into the micro, with you as a professor in a classroom. In your book, you share a couple really, for me, eye-opening stories about the ways that you make mistakes, the ways that you navigate the challenges that you might be met with. And so there are a couple stories, one in which you call one of your Latina students by someone else's name, and you kind of, in what I felt when I read it, was like you kind of doubled down and did it again, and then realized, oh, I've made this mistake. And I thought to myself, as you described how you took that in, where you grounded, you acknowledged, you apologized, it made me think of all the faculty members that we have, all the teachers that we have in our community, and, moments that they may misstep. And I just thought that was so relatable and vulnerable, actually, for you to share. Yeah. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you navigate your potential to harm in moments like that.
Yeah, thank you. That, again, it's a challenge for all of us to try to, minimize the harm that any one of us might do, because again, we've all imbibed not just stories of who matters and who doesn't, and limited histories, right? Histories that have kind of made certain people the victors and the exceptions, and then other people constantly denigrated, right? We've been miseducated. So we're working from miseducation, let's name that. And then our brains as human brains, right? We know, right? The social psychologists tell us we all develop these schemas, stereotypes, right? We move through the world placing things in categories based on our experiences, based on information we've been told, to kind of give us shortcuts so that we can navigate the world more quickly. I have a schema in my head, we all do, for a chair. All right. And talk about this quite often because that's a kind of a common thing. It's like, what a chair is. You don't, every time you see something that looks like a chair, have to stop, recon it, figure out what is that. It's a chair. If you're tired, you can sit in it. The problem is that we have schemas for people too that are not unlike this. And whereas it works for a chair, we don't want to overinvest in investigating what a chair is. With human beings, we do damage when we put them in categories and then treat them from that place. But the thing is, our brains do this, So in the story that I share, it's me having called a Latinx female student by one name. I not use the actual names in the book, right? But I think I used, maybe the student's name was Rosarita, but I called her Maria. And I in the book I talk about how I called her Maria, then I called her Maria again. I'm like, why is she not responding? And she's like, because that's not my name. And we had been in conversations and in class for months by that point. So it wasn't that we just met, right? And she and I had many one-on-one conversations. And so it was very kind of embarrassing. Number one, you never want to mess up anybody's name. But it was obvious to me that wasn't like I had called her Mary, right? Or some other name. It was a name that had a kind of Latina spin to it, which to my own mind, if I'm honest, in a way that is embarrassing to admit, kind of revealed a little bit of the way my brain was like reaching for, like, in other words, recognizing that she was of this category that I have. And while I hope and pray that my category for Latina has nothing but beautiful, wonderful things, the risk is that all of us, when we have these categories, we imbibe all the kinds of stereotypes and the trainings we have. And the risk is that it can impact how we interact, receive, valorize, respect, uplift, listen to people in these different categories. So of course, I therefore, like everybody else, want to work to look at the content of my categories, as was the title of a kind of an important article on this very thing that, like, we're all walking around operating from these often underappreciated, hidden cognitive dynamics. We're all moving through the world having to work with this. So we all need to work to disrupt our biases as a means of demonstrating how we want to bring mindfulness to bear on minimizing racial harm in the world. So I paused, noticed that this was at stake, noticed that other people were watching, my students were watching, they were being impacted by this, and apologized, right? And I've told the story before, and some people have said, well, what? People are too sensitive. We're getting older. We are going to mess up people. It's like, well, maybe that is true. It's not, it is true that it's hard sometimes to remember names, and we meet hundreds of students, and we could say all those things and refuse to acknowledge that actually somebody has been wounded by what we said. And so the invitation is to say, you might have a way of understanding your intent, my intention, but I also understand the impact. And I want to mind that gap between my intention and the impact. And that's what mindfulness can help us do.
Thank you so much. Now, I do want to make room for audience questions. I do have one more I have to ask you before we turn to audience. This thing of trigger, of feeling triggered, I think is so real in this work as well. And in the book, you talk about downregulating your reactivity when feeling triggered. And I thought to myself, I have practiced mindfulness for a while now and still
Yes.
struggle sometimes
Yes.
with this. And so I wondered if you could even give us a high level, a
Yes.
sense of what the steps are when you
Yes.
find yourself in that trigger moment
Yes.
to manage the reactivity.
Yes, I can. So I would say one acronym to use here that I use in my book too and talk about is RAIN. It's a teaching acronym that summarizes what mindfulness is meant to offer, right? RAIN. So somebody says something that's triggering, recognizing R, the first letter of the RAIN acronym. Just recognize, oh my goodness, I can feel the tightness in my chest, the something, the stone in my belly, or the flush of heat as I'm getting like really angry just that this person said this. I'm looking for somebody to look at and be like, did we just hear this? So recognize that we're feeling some triggering response. Except for the moment, that's what's happening. A story that I wrote about was when, in an example from my classroom, a student said, when talking about writing a paper for a class, I'm going to write about the Rodney King beating, and I'm going to write that I think it was deserved. And the student happened to actually be AAPI, an Asian American heritage student, born and raised in California, Southern Cal. And really just put out there that he was going to make this argument. And when it was said, it really hit me, and I could feel like, part of me wanted to react, but I was able to draw on my mindfulness and notice, wow, you're at risk here of acting out of alignment with your values. As a professor, as a person privileged to hold that responsibility on behalf of everybody, including this one student, I, felt myself drawing on mindfulness to accept, all right, I'm feeling triggered, but I want to investigate this. I'm feeling a lot of different things, but how can I, but I'm also able to see and then choose how to respond rather than react. And so recognize, accept, I investigate, well, what's happening and what can I choose if I'm at my highest and best in terms of how to respond right here and now. And then RAIN, do all of that with as little attachment or identification, non-attachment, non-identification. You're not trying to tell a story of like, I'm this way, that student's that way. It's like, that was happening in the moment. I've moved through it. I might have subsequent conversations with that student. I might do something else. But in that moment, I navigated it drawing on mindfulness.
Wow. I love that story in particular, because I'm like, ooh, what did she do? How did she handle it? So thank you. Thank you for the example. I am going to lovingly turn it to our audience. We have some amazing questions. So I'm just going to read a couple of these questions for you. The first one says, can you talk about sharing mindfulness with men of color? What have been your successes or challenges?
Well, let's see. I mean, I've had successes for sure with sharing mindfulness with men of color. I'm happen to be thinking right now. Well, first of all, I've met a lot of men who have encountered mindfulness in a lot of different settings, Black men. So I teach at a university, but I also work with people who are involved in the criminal justice system. And certainly I know that I've had a range of interactions with men of color around this. I've had men who are in professional settings come into some appreciation that they needed to, like they have been suffering too. I write in the last part of my book, which is called Liberating, right? So my book proceeds from like grounding in the practices, seeing more of what there is to see, being able to be with it, doing work around it, and then feeling some freedom. And that the person that whose voice I allow to open up that part of the book is an African-American man with whom I'd worked here in San Francisco. He'd been a social justice advocate. He was older than me. And he said, after the 7-week intro to mindfulness that I'd offered here, for the first time in my history, I feel free. Not in my history. He said, for the first time in my memory in a long time, I'm feeling free. And so that is an example of a kind of experience I've had where if, a brother is like willing to overcome whatever skepticism or concern and just practice. As I said before, I like to not talk at people about mindfulness, but say, let's pause. Let's take a deep breath. Let's feel the ground of support beneath you right here, right now. And just notice what happens when you allow yourself to allow your thoughts to subside and feel the restoration that can come from a cleansing breath.
Mm-hmm.
When I've had those opportunities to invite practice, then I have seen, Black men shift and become kind of advocates when they have been skeptics. And I know I have friends who have actually encountered mindfulness in other settings, like in the criminal justice system, formerly incarcerated friends of mine who now teach mindfulness, who are much more eloquent than I could ever be about how these practices that they might have resisted at first or not seen the value of help them survive, the hell of their circumstances being in prison, and help them survive the difficulty of transitioning and finding a place in a society that would just as easily put them back. So yeah, there are many stories that I could share. And yet I want to say, mindfulness isn't for everyone. I don't claim that either. But I think if anyone might be willing to explore it, I'm willing to sit with them, have a conversation, and see, help folks see what might be the potential for mindfulness in their lives.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I have another question. With compassion and equanimity at the core of mindfulness, how do we engage those who actively stand in the way of justice? Those who throw their children out or vote against their own interests, etc.
It's hard, right?
Right. I was like,
it's really
good
hard.
question.
Yeah, it's a great question. No, I mean, again, I want to just somehow disabuse anybody who might be here of the notion that mindfulness means that it's a kind of a panacea, and it's a kind of a way that it's going to absolve us of feeling that we failed, feeling that we missed. There are going to be times when we are going to try and fail to have that experience that we've connected. We don't know what impact we might have on someone down a road that we may never see it. And so, one of the things that I've worked with is developing that ability to do the best I can. But again, remember, Rain, non-attachment. Like, you do the best you can, and then you have to be willing to let go and recognize that, as the Serenity Prayer told us, right? We have to, have that courage to change the things we can, accept the things we cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so, while we work to meet those people who are actively engaged in injustice with a kind of a fierce practice of disrupting that injustice, that doesn't mean, though, that we aren't going to the next day see them revert back to the practice or see someone new come to take their place. In other words, to be alive is to be called, I think, as I mentioned before, to discern how do we want to live in that space between, with the set off by the dash, that birth date and that end date that we don't know when it's going to be, but everybody knows, everybody in the hearing space of my voice, we know we don't have forever to live. How do we want to live is the ultimate question. And so if we're doing the best we can and then creating space for possibility, because nobody should be seen through the lens of the worst thing they've ever done, including the biggest, most racist thing they've ever done, if they're still alive and able to make a difference from there. And I do think that it's hard to imagine people changing And I do think it's true. We have to like look at what is here. And if people are not changing, they're not changing. We need to recognize that. We do not need to be in a fog about that. But so it's that delicate dance of like meeting people with possibilities, seeing potential, doing what we can to work with that energy of possibility, but not being naive. And if somebody is threatening us, harming us, get out of harm's way.
Right.
Disrupt that violence. I don't suffer fools. I definitely don't suffer violence. I will draw a line quickly if someone's threatening violence. But, so it is about trying to discern what's called for here. And that is what mindfulness can support us in doing.
Yeah, I mean, so much said there. And I think, noticing the mindfulness helps answer all those questions too. So thank you for that. How do you suggest shifting social justice work cultures that do not often prioritize joy, relaxation, and a healthy work-life balance? This is a good one.
It's very good. And so one of the things I've been privileged to do the last year is work with the American Bar Association's Commission on Lawyer Assistance Program. So the ABA, regulator of all lawyers, has realized, for example, that law firms are not the most just places sometimes, certainly don't enhance the well-being of people who are there to try to do justice for the world. And so one of the things that organization has sought to do is to galvanize law firms and then law schools, and through that, all folks who do criminal justice and other types of justice work. The word isn't really gotten out as well as it might. But the idea is to try to have folks, have these organizations, these systems, these institutions embrace a well-being pledge. And so I'm going to offer that to everybody in the hearing of my voice. You can do it from wherever you are. We all have power to make a difference wherever you are. Call for a pledge to respect the need we all have as human beings for kindness, for boundaries. I cannot tell you during this period of the coronavirus, can we talk about how the fact that we are able to do everything around the clock and do Zoom, all of a sudden, let's have a work meeting at 8:00 at night. Thankfully, I've seen some schools and institutions say, be it resolved. The working hours are from 8 or 9 to 5. We're not holding meetings on the weekends and in the evenings because we can on Zoom. And we know you have Zoom wherever you are. Like, so again, a pledge, right? To honor and respect, not to be sending emails that you expect people to read and return to and reply to at all hours. Like I sent the email at 2 a.m. and you hadn't responded by 7. No. So establishing commitments that we live by and that we hold ourselves accountable to, self-accountability, and then hold each other accountable. It's not easy, but we build coalitions for that, right? We turn to our colleague at work and we say, how can we together, right? Nobody does it alone. How can we work together to try to raise awareness that we need justice right here, right now? We need a personal commitment to justice and well-being in this workplace. It's not easy, but I hear you and I honor it. I think, again, we live in a world and our social justice advocacy work is part and parcel of a neoliberal culture that's constantly also, right? We're in the culture. And so we're very vulnerable to having these outward facing promises. But then you look at how are we living here? We're like working ourselves to death. We're being disrespectful and mean to each other. This is not, no. It's a values aligned invitation, I think, to live our values and start where we are. Always, always, always.
Well, I would say speak a word because I think there's so much there. So thank you. Our next question comes, can you speak to the intersections of patriarchy, white supremacy, and our capitalist work ethic?
Well, and I was just alluding to it a little bit, right? I mean, it's like, I mean, where do you even begin? It's everywhere. And it's why a person like me who grew up poor and, you know, cisgender, female and brown, Black body, you know, I mean, when things happen to me in the world, I'm never sure exactly. Like, when I have gone out shopping for a car and have a hard time getting somebody to show me a car because they've sized me up. I happen to go to the wrong car dealership, I guess. They look at me and size me up as somebody who can't afford their cars. It's like, is that because I look younger than they think I am? I'm brown, I'm female. I don't know. But I do know if I stay here, I'm at risk of paying more for a car. If I ever get somebody to talk to me, then I probably should, because we know that in the marketplaces, right, these biases do lead to material deprivation, economic, they kind of they constitute what causes and leads to or exacerbates economic inequality, right?
Mm-hmm.
People are paying more for things because of what we look like and how we're met in the world. So unpacking this is not easy. And so while my conversation, the book that I wrote, is about the race aspect of this, absolutely everything that I work toward is like radically intersectional, really. I think sometimes we need to pause, and I talk about rotating the center of our concern. I mean by that kind of attention work, right? We center sometimes a conversation about race, not because you can ever really untie race from gender, class, immigration status, age, disability, all the different ways that we find ourselves met by systems of oppression in the world. And they do intersect profoundly. So, but the fact that everything is intersectional doesn't mean we shouldn't stop and have an hour-long conversation about race. We in fact, it maybe highlights, because what we might find is if we don't, it can get lost. We can very easily find ourselves starting out trying to talk about race, but now the whole conversation has now turned to class, or the whole conversation has now turned to gender. So, really having a commitment to saying, we need to be mindful that intersectionality, the reality of that, you cannot, when I have an experience, I might be able to have a sense that part of it is about race, but do I really ever really know that a Black man in my situation would have had the same exact experience? Yeah, it depends. Maybe yes, maybe I won't know. Maybe I can say for sure, no, you wouldn't know, depending on the circumstance, right? When I walk down the street and someone yells something out at me that suggests that I'm somebody that, either is a prostitute or would be an easy, these are kinds of things that I know are this sort of probably this intersection between race and gender, and maybe some assumption people are making because I wore some jeans or a sweatshirt about class. Mm-hmm. So again, that's how it happens, how the constructions are happening and being attached to people, and how we are met with them and potentially wounded by them. So bringing mindfulness to bear as a first approximation, again, first, just basically saying, first of all, I deserve kindness, respect, and love in a world that is running the intersections of, racism, patriarchy, capitalism, run amok, predatory capitalism. Like, I deserve respect and kindness. And I'm going to start right here, right now. And I will set boundaries around people who don't get that, right, if necessary. And that doesn't mean I won't feel it. It doesn't mean that I'm going to disrupt patterns. But having that as an anchor is what I think a mindfulness practice can support us in doing. And then, yes, we need to build coalitions that are very capable of saying, all right, we need to have a conversation about the class implications of this policy. And we all need in on that. And we need to build enough trust that we can believe that if I am there for the conversation about how sex orientation minorities, how my lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans friends are disproportionately being impacted by this policy or that policy. As a straight woman, I want to be in that conversation. Right. I have been that ally. And it's not totally transactional, but let's face it, politics is about transactions sometimes, right? We do need to stand up for the group whose cause isn't the first one that we wake up to because it's not right in our own wheelhouse. But in doing that, we build that bridge of trustworthy collaborative coalition work, solidarity work that we have to build and strengthen if we're going to make good on the promise of this moment of multicultural, multiracial democracy that we are at risk of losing because of what's happening as a backlash to the civil rights gains that led to Obama being elected, that led to the shifting of Georgia from red to blue in the last election cycle. If we can't figure out how to build coalitions in which we work together and let other people's who are suffering, other people's suffering occupy all of our progressive commitments and build coalitions where we can trust each other to stand up for Black Lives Matter, because we're going to be there at the immigration rally, right? Even if immigration is not our issue, we've got to do that or else. So mindfulness can help us because it's never easy. I'm just going to say that again. This mindfulness to me is for helping us become better able to do the hard things that we are called to do in a world of climate distress, rising white supremacy again, and patriarchy again. Hard things have to be done, but we can do it. But we can do it better when we first figure out how to put the oxygen mask on ourselves and extend it to our brothers and sisters.
Yes, thank you. And I have a fun, light question. Can you share some of your favorite joy or pleasure practices?
Ooh, I think I have a lot of kind of pleasure and joy practices. They're simple often. So if anybody's from, I'm a person on Facebook, Twitter. I'm not so great with IG, but I use the socials to try to amplify the good a lot. And one of the ways I do that is with, sharing photographs of beautiful places, sunsets, flowers. Like, they don't have to be that ecstatic, like the time I was in, Hawaii, then I'm going to share the picture. No, it's like the time I walked out this front door and noticed a tree shifting from, green to fall colors. And I'm going to pay attention to that and not miss the color purple, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. So people who follow me on the socials will know that one of my pleasure, joy practices is just knowing that this moment that I have is not, I'm here. The next one isn't promised to me. Tomorrow isn't promised to me. I want to pay attention to the small, radical miracles that show up in my life every day. So it can be, me doing a happy dance over a particular orange that I have, that I'm feel fortunate to have. The fact that my tree outside is producing some lemons, like a miracle. I never do anything for it, and some lemons are produced. So it's really that. It's really just paying attention to the moments. This conversation is bringing me a lot of joy. This amazing, beautiful human being, Damali, I never connected with before. I'm having this rich conversation with because of CIIS and this community. This is an example. Don't miss these things. They're not small. It turns out even the small things, which are small, are not small.
Yes. And that, what? We have answered all of our audience questions. So I feel really good about that. I do want to close us out with one final, a thank you to you, deep bows of gratitude to you, because this has been such, for me, an illuminating conversation. I'm sure for everyone in our audience, they have learned something. There has been a gift in this conversation for each and every person. And I wanted to just close out on the principle of Ubuntu. And I hope I said that right. The kinship, the connection, because I think when we delve into such sensitive territory, it can be hard to see that kinship. But I wondered if you could just share something about those principles and if there's a practice that you want to connect with that so that we can just be in the space of mindful connection.
Thank you. So Ubuntu, some of you may be familiar with it. And if you're just hearing that word for the first time, I learned this through immigrants from South Africa. And I visited South Africa and talked to people there about it. It's a particular philosophy that translates as best as we might in English to recognizing our common humanity with this phrase: I am because you are, and because you are, I am. And in other words, it's really recognizing our interdependence as human beings. And so in my book, I offer a practice inspired by Ubuntu consciousness, right? This practice, which starts with a kind of willingness to turn toward other human beings. And we can do this whether someone knows we're doing it or not. We might find ourselves, this is a practice you can draw on silently if you're having a difficult moment with someone who you feel like you're going to disagree with, but you're trying to find common ground, right? This isn't like somebody's trying to bring out violence against you, but that you're just disagreeing around these issues and you're trying to find common ground. You might pause and just reflect, like, just like me, this person wants to be understood. And sometimes is misunderstood, right? And that's a way of saying we all as human beings go through the world, sometimes trying to be connecting, trying to have someone understand, being missed. And so it's looking at in the eyes of a person and saying, and sometimes we do this as a practice. We pause, we say it out loud. Just like me, this person has been misunderstood in life. And you look at the person, you know it's true. And you look into each other's eyes and it's like, oh my gosh, tears can come to your eyes. Just like me, this person struggles sometimes to be the best they can be and just feels themselves missing their mark, right? We all struggle. So these kinds of, this just like me is another kind of compassion building practice. Just like me, this person has known discrimination. Just like me, this person has also known love, right? So that's a piece of it, but also I am because you are. And because you are, I am. Literally, we're in this conversation because you all showed up. I'm here with Damali and able to have this conversation because of the questions you asked, the beautiful energy you brought. We are all benefiting, whether here in this conversation live or listening to this later, because we have been here together. And we have been shaped in some way, touched in some way by what has arisen only because we happen to be here together. So that is something that is really, really beautiful to remember. For me, breathing reminds me, taking a conscious breath. I didn't create the air that I breathe, but I depend on many human beings that I know and don't know for a quality of air that's safe enough that I can breathe it without dying of air pollution today, right? In other words, we live in an environment which, as we live and breathe, is constantly reminding us who picked the beans that made the coffee that we drank to wake up this morning, right? We are always relying on human beings' efforts in ways that we don't realize. So bringing compassion to the awareness that we are all struggling, we're all in a world working together in a world where we are actually cooperating more than we realize. Think of the many ways that just in driving through a town, you avoided accidents because everybody did just enough. I mean, sometimes there are accidents,
Right.
but most often, right? So we are much more cooperating than we realize. Remember that. And we are impacting each other in ways seen and not seen. So thank you. In the spirit of Ubuntu, I see you is another piece of that practice. Rather than just goodbye or hello, I see you. And I see you, Damali, and I thank you so much for your presence.
I see you, Rhonda. Thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this conversation with you. Again, and it's been rich and generative. So thank you. And I will turn it back over to Alex.
Thank you all so much for attending this evening. We hope you'll join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded tonight, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available on our YouTube channel at this very same link and on our Facebook page. We'll also feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at www.ciispod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful evening.